Casting crowns. I've got those. The problem is some of them are really difficult to sing and play. You'd be surprised. There are a lot of ballad style today, which is kind of interesting. Hey, I got a really cool word for you today. I got it in reverse order. I don't know why I wrote it in reverse order. Probably because I was so excited about it. But kata is down, and balo. This is one of those balo words, right? Parabalo, catabalo, diabalo, hyperbalo. This is balo. Balo means throw in Greek. And we get some really neat words from it. So this is a very interesting word. Kalabola means specifically to throw down. Throw down. But you say, well, throw down. So, we have near throw, to throw near, is a parabola, right? And a diabola is, and basically we have taken it to the extreme because we always talk about a logos to telos. Well, all of our bolo words have to do, generally, our prefix suffix words in Greek have to do with some degree of a logos to telos, right? So a near throw is basically a logos to telos that has one telos, right? A singular telos. Because we know a telos, this Greek stuff gets very geometric and very complex very quickly, but we know that a telos is the reflection, basically, of the vanishing point of a thing. So these get really complex. So a parabolo is, a near throw. We note that that is near throw because it relates to they only had a singular axis, but they would say that it crosses the axis at one point, where a hyperbole, right, doesn't cross the axis or crosses the axis at multiple points, is what they would say. And then a diabolo doesn't cross the axis at any point at all. So then they would say that, you remember, diabolo is sometimes translated in our Bibles as the devil. Somebody with no telos, a logos with no telos. So a hyperbole is infinite telos, a parabole is a singular telos, a unitary telos, and then a diabolo has zero, has no telos. So this has got to fit within this. Well, it does. A down throw, a throwdown in Greek in this context is a logos. It happens to be a deposition. Now, here we can compare Greek culture to Anglo-Saxon culture. Okay, in Anglo-Saxon culture, if I were going to throw down, basically give you an insult, give you a telos, a deposition, our lawyers, right? A deposition is a legal throwdown, right? You go to somebody and say, hey, here's a deposition, right? In Anglo-Saxon culture, what is a throwdown? You insulted me.
Some sort of duel or challenge.
Yeah, exactly. This is really interesting because, and I'm not making a direct comparison, but there is a direct comparison here. The word for throwdown in the Greek basically means, okay, when I throw down a legal deposition against you, I'm challenging you legally, right? In our Anglo-Saxon culture, we would think first not of a legal deposition. I mean, that's where we eventually get to, especially if you do hit somebody with your gloves. But the whole point is, I think it's very interesting that here we have a cultural point because the Greeks were fighters, right? But they fought as a group for their city-state. You don't hear a lot about duels in Greek culture, right? Because how do you think they did their duels? How did Socrates do his duels?
Verbally? Debate.
Verbally, exactly. They had symposium, right? And in symposium, they weren't fighting with hands and fists. They were fighting with their words, right? And that's the way they did it. Today we have symposiums, and we're kind of fighting-ish a little ways. But the Romans, they like the gladiators and the fisticuffs, and then our culture kind of is that way too. We have football and basketball and those kind of things. But I think it's really interesting that it's not necessarily a martial word, but this concept of a logos with a telos for the purpose of proving, right? Now what's interesting about this is it's translated as to conceive or foundation. Does anybody see a problem with that? Conceive or foundation. A throwdown, which is a deposition that's translated as conceive or foundation. Remember last week we had the word, and it's in the pile. What was the word last week? Remember thelema? Thelemos. And remember, it was translated foundation. But what's the real meaning of that word? I think it's in there. Something put down, right? So already in two different statements in Hebrews, we have two different words that obviously don't mean foundation, but are being used as foundation. We'll see that in the text today.
Can it be thought of as a statement of opinion?
A katabola?
Yeah. This is how I feel. No argument, just a statement.
It's a statement it's a logos that's being put out as I'm going to prove this in court, right? So I'm presenting a logos against you and saying, all right, we're going to go to a court of our peers or law or whatever, and they're going to determine the rightness or wrongness of this. So, interesting, right?
It's like an opening statement.
Like an opening statement, or like your court filing, right? Now, what's interesting about this, like I said, look at what it's translated as. Conceiver foundation. I can't conceive of how this could be, a foundation of anything. But whatever. I mean, so our translators gave us this. And by the way, the NIV does the same thing. We'll see how it works anyway. The other one is another interesting word. See, I didn't write this out, did I? Katabolen, katabolen, because it's a declension, right? T-I, I'm doing it on the top, T-I-K-T-O. The reason I chose this word is because it's, the majority text says that King James uses this, and the majority text says this is an alternate reading that has this word in it. So the NIV doesn't have this word, but the NIV will have a little note in the bottom of your Bible about this. The King James includes it, and so I thought that'd be interesting to have. This word is specifically means to produce. To produce, a verb, to produce. And it comes from tico, again, to produce a seed. What's interesting is, and I didn't give you this, but spermazoa, we'll see it. Spermazoa was considered the part of the seed that produced, that the man gave, and in the Greek culture, tikto was the sperm, the seed part that the woman provided to produce a child. Now, if you know anything about ancient cultures, what's odd about this idea in ancient cultures?
That the woman had anything to do with it.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. In what came to us and through the Roman culture, and later through the Anglo-Saxon and the Romantic cultures, the Charlemagne, the French, all those cultures, the idea that woman was simply a vessel and that the man provided mannequin, the seed that grew into the vessel. The fact that the Greeks have two words for it, that's kind of interesting. I mean, you know, that's something a little bit new in our conception of ancient cultures.
Then why did they always blame the woman for not having a boy then?
Because they could.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of that comes out of the Anglo-Saxon culture, and yeah, you know, there are all kinds of really interesting, you know, this is, if I were going to teach kids history, right, these are the questions that I'd want to answer philosophically and understand. And I know that we understand them, right? I don't have a ready answer because I haven't really studied it. But why do we have, you know, I kind of understand ancient cultures, Greek cultures, you know, Roman. I do understand Anglo-Saxon culture pretty well. But, you know, some of these details, right? These are the kind of details that we ask. You know, the famous one I always want to know, what's the difference between a concubine and a wife? Yeah. And the difference is that a concubine is a slave with conjugal rights. So, you know, they could have answered this question really easily, but they won't ever do it because then you have to explain what is conjugal rights and what is a slave and what does it mean to, right? And so you never tell it to they'll tell sixth graders how to put on a condom, but they won't tell them this kind of stuff because it would be too bad for their minds, right? But anyway, it's just interesting. We have these Greek words and things that enlighten us to the culture and society, right? I think it's kind of interesting. So, the first one, I've got it written down for you, but persuasion stands under an expectation of proof of deeds not seen. And then the second verse, I threw that in, and I want you to remember this. Assigning a reason, in this the members of the Israelite Sanhedrin became a witness, that is, to Christ. And we'll see other references to Christ, not quite in these. But where we ended up last time is 8. And I didn't finish, I finished 8 pretty much, but let me remind you what 8 says. By faith Abraham, this is the NIV. By faith Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. The translation of this from the Greek is, Abraham was persuaded by a call to issue into a place which he was about to take as an heirship. He listened and issued, not putting his mind upon where he went. So he went without knowing where he's going. Which, if you go back to the premise of this entire, I hate to say chapter because it's a section, right? This entire section. Persuasion stands under an expectation of proof of deeds not seen. So each of these persuasion topics or examples is going to be specifically, but persuasion stands under an expectation of proof of deeds not seen. So the people were persuaded, and then because they were persuaded, something happened, right? So I think this is important. It's not the opposite. It wasn't by faith, and then it wasn't that they had faith, and then something happened. They were persuaded, and then they did what they were told to do, and then something happened, right? So it's a direct relationship. The thing that I want to remind you, okay, Genesis 12, 1, 5, and 7. In Genesis 12, it begins, the Lord said to Abram, leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. And then in 2, I will make you a great nation and will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. Whoever curses you, I'll curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So Abram left as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. I think that's interesting. I'm not 75 years old, and I can't imagine, you know, taking off at 75 to go someplace. Especially since, you know, we can get into great detail, but Abraham came from Ur of Chaldees. And Ur of Chaldees, what did they worship? The moon goddess, yeah, the moon god, the moon goddess. And this is interesting because this is a complete, Judaism and Christianity are the two religions that don't follow remember the things of religion? You have animism, you have pantheonic paganism, you have mysterion, and you have Gnosticism. And every religion that you can imagine follows this group except two, and that's Judaism and Christianity. Judaism, we believe, of course, like most, started. No, it didn't. Did it? What does? Okay, whether you want to think it or not, in Genesis, what does Genesis say? In the beginning, gods, with a singular verb. Talk about a perceptive concept, right? And we've talked about it philosophically and theologically and go, whoa, this is deep stuff. But it doesn't appear like they started with animism at all. Because if anything, they started with, no, they didn't have pantheonic paganism. They had one God who was three parts. But they're one part, but they're three parts. Right? They're trying to express this. So they weren't animistic and they weren't pantheonic pagans. They looked like a Mysterion when they became Christianity. In fact, Judaism looks a lot like a Mysterion. You know, remember I told you, we forget this. This is the thing, you know, CNN doesn't report this information in the world. But remember, what was the big thing that the Pharisees did in the world, in the diaspora? They were proselytizing. They were proselytizing like crazy because Judaism looks like a Mysterion. It's not as good a Mysterion as the Mysterion of Christ, right? Because do they have a mystery?
That the Messiah will come, I guess.
Well, you know, see, if you talk to your Orthodox, if you talk to a Sadducee, what would the Sadducee tell you about the coming of the Messiah? Well, I'm not so sure. What would he need to save us from? We have our system. What would the Pharisees say? The Pharisee would say, yeah, you got to be saved because the sacrificial system doesn't work. It doesn't work for you. Because every sin is intentional, right? In the Mishnah, it states it, the Mishnah, go look at your Talmud and your Mishnah, which I know you got, right? It's this big and it's hard to carry around. But if you had your Talmud and your Mishnah, actually you can put it in your iPad. But if you had your Talmud and your Mishnah, you would see right in the beginning of the introduction to it, it says, we know there is no sacrifice for intentional sin. And they go back to the Deuteronomy verse that I show you all the time, that Leviticus verse that says there is no sacrifice for intentional sin. They knew that. The Pharisees knew that. The Sadducees ignored that. Right? Sadducees didn't believe in heaven. Matter of fact, Orthodox Judaism, a pure Orthodox Jew does not believe in heaven. You're going to Gehenna, no matter what. You're gone. Sorry, it's sayonara. Just like the Greeks, the early Greeks, you're going to Hades, right? So, interesting stuff. And then, you know, Gnosticism, Christianity helped cause Gnosticism, but it's also caused by scientific knowledge. So, Judaism, Christianity really didn't move through these things. And you see, it says, so Abram left, this is 4, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abraham was 75 years old and set off from Haran. He took his wife, Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated, and the people they had acquired in Haran, and set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. I wanted you to note that you got to remember, before 1833, every culture was a slave culture. Until 1833, every culture was a slave culture. In 1833, what happened? The British,
Slave trade was abolished.
by the British Parliament. Yep, British Parliament, led by the guy who wrote Amazing Grace.
John Newton and William Wilberforce.
Yeah, amazing, isn't it? That Western civilization, of course, had slavery, just like every other culture, until Christianity, acting through Western civilization, abolished slavery. And you notice in less than 100 years, basically almost all slavery on the globe, at least in Western civilization, Western cultures, was gone.
Or illegal, at least. I mean, it still exists pretty widely. widespread in illegal forms.
It does, in illegal forms. Well, okay, it's a natural human sin. But you know what? We could be like the prohibitionists. Now, prohibition of a substance like alcohol is probably a bad idea, but like the drug guys, okay, well, we can't stop them, so we might as well do them. We can't stop slavery, we might as well have slavery. I just had to throw that in, I'm sorry. But every culture before 1833 was a slave-based culture. And so you notice it said all the possessions they'd accumulated and the people they'd acquired at Haran. Lots of slaves. Abram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree Moriah at Shechem at the time the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared, 7. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. Interesting stuff. And so he went on to the hills of Bethel. So, with that and Abraham, later named Abraham, we go on to 9. Got lots of notes in here. Okay, 9. This is still about Abraham. So we have our Abraham in our mind. This is the NIV. By faith he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. That's what it says in the NIV, the translation. Let's parse it. By is added. Faith, it's not faith, it's persuasion, pistis. Persuasion. He sojourned. It's peroikeo. I thought about giving it to you as a word of the day because we love para. Para is near. Oikeo is your house. Oikeo is a house or a home. So near dwell, to dwell near. Sojourn, that sounds kind of close. Sojourn kind of gives you the idea that he was traveling, but it says literally he dwelt near. In, ice is into or in. The, ho is correct. Land, gay. I thought about giving you this word gay, but we talk about gay so much, I think gay is kind of a given concept. But to remind you, the gay is interesting, because here I have, here's the cosmos. Here is theos. Theos and the plenum of everything. And within the plenum of everything is cosmos. And then within the cosmos, the created universe, is the philosophia, that which man can know. And then within that is the gay. So the gay is the physical part of the world. Now it's interesting, you really can't translate gay as land. You can translate gay as soil or world. So interesting, because if he sojourned, dwelt near, into the land of Epangelia. Now, here's that word, right? Do you remember at the beginning of Hebrews, they translated this word as the message from the angels, and the promise of the angels, and this and that of this and that, and other things. And we've seen it translated as gospel, and we see it translated as the real word of Epangelia is the message of the gods, period dot, and the message of God within the context of theos, right? Of Christ and theos. So, very interesting that they translated this as Epangelia as promise. Again, they're playing with us here. I wish they would keep the same translation. As is hos, it's which. It's not as, it's which how. Hos, which how. In is added. A strange country. It's allotrios. Another's. It's literally in Greek. Another's. Kata oiko. Kata oiko. Okay. Kata oiko. Kata, down. Oiko, house or home. So down house down. Katabola, kata oiko. And before we had para oiko. I mean, this is an accident, okay? He near dwelt, and then he down dwelt. Down dwelt, dwelling, it literally means to house permanently. To house permanently. In tabernacles, it's skina, a tent, with it's metat, amid, literally amid. Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him. Suk klernomos, we had this word before, together a share by lot. Before, Abraham was a share by lot. And before him, let's see, was Noah? Somebody else was a share by lot. A share by lot of these, same, autos. It's literally itself. Evangelia, the message of the gods. Okay, so literally this says, persuaded he dwelt near into the soil of the message of the gods, which how another's housed permanently in a tent amid Isaac and Jacob, that together a share by lot, the itself a message of the gods. So we need a translation, right? So I'll give you a translation. This is probably this is a good English translation of what it says literally. Persuaded he dwelt near into the land announced by God, in which he housed permanently in another's tent amid Isaac and Jacob. They together shares by lot of the same announcement of God. Persuaded he dwelt near into the land announced by God, in which he housed permanently in another's tent amid Isaac and Jacob. They together shares by lot of the same announcement of God. Why do you think it says he housed permanently in another's tent?
He settled the two.
Yeah, it wasn't his land. I mean, other people were living there.
What do you think? Is that what you think?
Well, when I first said house permanently, I thought of the tabernacle. Initially it was in a tent, and then they built the temple.
That was Solomon, so quite a while later.
Yeah, I think there's a little more here than meets the eye, right? Or I would say that meets the ear, especially in NIV. NIV makes it sound pretty simple, right? By faith he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. Wow, that's easy, right? Where did they get those words? He persuaded he dwelt near into the land. He dwelt near into the land announced by God, in which he housed permanently in another's tent amid Isaac and Jacob. They together shares by lot of the same announcement of God. Very interesting. I don't want to go too far with this, but I think there's a little bit about the tabernacle and some foreshadowing about the tabernacle here. But I'll leave that to you. I just think it's very interesting they use the word to house permanently in another's tent. Let's see what it says. Let's see what it says in the Old Testament. Genesis 12, this is Genesis 12, 8, 13, 3, 18, 18, 1, 9. Let's see what it says specifically in Genesis. Let's see, in chapter 12, 1, the Lord said, Abraham, leave your country, and then I'll skip to 8, and it says, and 7. The Lord appeared to Abraham and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he went on towards the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east, and there he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. Okay, so where was God? Figuratively and literally. If he went, from there he went on toward the hills, toward Bethel, and okay, it says, the Lord appeared to Abram. He appeared to Abram. To your offspring I will give this land. So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. Then it says, from there he went on towards the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. Whose tent was he housed in? And who was he housed permanently with? Greeks understand this. Hebrews too. What did the Hebrews do? What did God tell the Hebrews to do? They built a tabernacle, right? And the tabernacle had a holy of holies and a holy place, and it had walls. And then it had an altar. The altar was within the walls, right? Within the tent, the skina. And who lived permanently in that place?
The Spirit of the Lord.
The Lord God Almighty was in the Holy of Holies. Right? That's the Hebrew concept. Look what it says. The Lord appeared to Abram. He appeared to Abram. To your offspring I give thee this land. So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he went on towards the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. Okay, if you're a Greek reading this in the Septuagint, what do you assume? The Greeks are literal or figurative? Literal. So if you're a Greek reading this in the Septuagint, Greek-minded person, where was God?
There in the tent where he made the altar.
With Abraham. With Abraham. Literally with Abraham. Confirmed by the fact that he built an altar to him. And guess where the altars of all the Hebrews went? Inside the tent. Remember, this is the problem that it caused for them, right? Because the minute the Greeks saw this, the Greeks said,
Terrible.
no. Tear down that wall, because the Mesocline is an affront. You can't slaughter animals inside of a temple. This is a really interesting concept, and a very important concept, because Jesus Christ was slaughtered on a crucifix, on a cross, right? And the first thing that happened was he either went into or went out of the holy place. Remember that? This is pretty interesting. So when the Greeks had destroyed the temple, they destroyed the outer temple wall, right? So that the altar was inside. When they rebuilt the temple wall, we believe they call it a mesocline, so it was a lower wall. They did a lower wall to intentionally not irritate the Greeks, Romans, and everybody else, right? This is interesting, right? And so literally when Christ was slaughtered, when he was sacrificed, he was outside the mesocline, but the Greeks would have said he was in the proper place for a slaughter, for a sacrifice, right? And so the first thing that he did, though, and I don't know which one to argue, when it ripped the curtain of the most holy place, right, the Holy of Holies, did he go in or go out? I'd say he went in, right? He went in, and maybe he went back out again, because God was dead. God was dead. That's what that's what the Christians said. God was dead. It's one God. You don't have two gods, right? So if Christ is God, he died. He went to hell. He brought out the souls of hell and took his place in the heavens. That's our God. Talk about powerful. Because God has power over death and life and everything else. But anyway, so from this concept, I think we can see in the Old Testament idea, especially from the Greek idea, that they were seeing that God dwelt with Abraham. And there's no reason not to think that, right? Within the context of what it says in the Greek and within the context of the Old Testament. Now, our impression is that he didn't permanently dwell with them, but the Hebrews make this point. The Hebrew writer makes this point. Announced by God, in which he housed permanently in another's tent amid Isaac and Jacob. And what's interesting is it says that they were sharers by lot, just like he was, of this promised land. Now, I will point this out. This is not unusual or odd. Remember when we studied Romans? And I told you the main thing about Romans was, does this God apply to me? Because gods applied to areas, right? The Greek gods didn't have any power outside of Greece, or that was their assumption. The Roman gods didn't have power out of Rome or Italy. That was their assumption. The Egyptian gods didn't have power outside of Egypt. And by the way, this was one of the things that Hippolytus, if you ever read Hippolytus, one of the big deals that Hippolytus caused was he caused a question in the mind of the Greeks. You know what that question was? Do our gods apply in other nations? This was this is a huge problem. People did not travel, right? And so Hippolytus traveled to Egypt, according to his accounts. He traveled to Rome. He traveled to the Carthage lands. So when Hippolytus traveled and he saw these other gods, his thing was to make a spreadsheet with the Greek gods on it and try to align it with the Egyptian gods and the Roman gods. Now we know the Roman gods directly aligned their gods with the Greek gods, right? But he tried to do the same thing for the Egyptian gods, and he found out that what? They weren't the same. So do you see there's a crisis of faith here? Right? What is the point, or what is the view of the ancient world about Jehovah Jireh? Where does he live, and what? In Israel Levant, right? He is the God of Israel. The question Romans had was, does this God apply to me and to my place, right? So the permanent place of Jehovah Jireh is Israel, the promised land, the place he promised. Now, but I want to point out this. You notice it uses the word gay. Gay is not properly a land. If I wanted to use a word in Greek, I would not use gay for the land or a nation. Gay presumes
Physical world.
the world, right. And by the way, just before this, we had who? Noah, right? And in Noah, it says the gay, the land, the soil, the gay was overwhelmed in that incident, right? So the presumption here is, well, the logos tetelos presumption here is, what is the permanent tent of God? The gay, right? The world, not just a land or a place. This goes back to, I think the Romans answered the question for the believers. This question. The Hebrews are starting with this context, right? And we agree. Don't you agree? God is God of all, right? And that's our assumption too. It's a logical assumption. 13 says, in 13:1, so Abram went up from Egypt to Negev with his wife and everything he had, and Lot went with him, and Abram had become very wealthy in livestock and silver and gold. From Negev, he went from place to place until he came to Bethel, to the place between Bethel and Ai, where his tent had been earlier, and where he had first built an altar. Now, I want to point out something else. Early cultures start as hunter-gatherers, and then they become shepherders, and then there's a whole other group. Eventually there's this group that kind of go to agriculture, but agriculture's tough. The only places where agriculture start are alluvial plains, where the waters, the plains of the Nile, the Danube, the Yangtze River, because what's the problem with agriculture?
Irrigation.
Well, you need irrigation, but there's something even worse.
You get invaded all the time, you get stuff taken from you.
There's something even worse, but although you're on the right point, there's something even worse. What happens, the first crop that I have is really good.
Soil depletion.
Soil depletion is the problem in agriculture. And so until something happened, you always had to have nutrients so it's always in alluvial plains where agriculture started. What caused agriculture to become universal?
You look at domestication of animals.
Having the oxen plow and the
Yeah, yeah.
That is
domestication.
precisely correct. And the way that oxen, I mean, this stuff in history is so wrapped up to each other. The reason animals became available, and especially horses, horses could not pull people. They always put two, and you couldn't have one. So you always put two horses on a chariot. The original warfare went originally from basically the initial warfare, when they could really do it. There's lots of other places, but they went almost universally to chariots. The problem with chariots is the Egyptians discovered a method called, they didn't call it the phalanx, but it became the Greek phalanx to defeat chariots. So chariots were easily defeated by masses of trained men working together. So guess what happened to the chariots? Bye-bye. And what did you have a whole lot of? Horses. And so the horses they had to get rid of, and what happened to the horses? The horses went into agriculture because some bright guy that we don't know invented a thing. Maybe a woman did it because she didn't want to have to be out there digging the fields. And somebody invented this great idea called a plow. And so a plow with two horses, you had to have two together pulling this thing, could allow you to plow ground. And guess what? They pooped on the ground, which caused you to have fertilizer and re-nourish the ground, which meant agriculture could be done in other places than alluvial plains. This is the great thing of agriculture. And you notice you have shepherds in agriculture, but with agriculture came some other group. The pillage group. Guess what the Israelis were? A pillage society. Usually pillagers come out of shepherds. Okay? And look what it says. From Negev he went, this is Abram. Abraham became very wealthy in livestock, in silver and gold. This is synopsis. Now's the body, the explanation. From the Negev he went from place to place until he came to Bethel, to the place between Bethel and Ai, where his tent had been earlier. What was he doing? He was pillaging. Yeah, you just don't wander around. What do you think he was doing? Selling stuff? Yeah, here, I'm selling you some jewelry, you know. Here, we made this on our looms. No, the guy was pillaging, burning and pillaging, because that was his culture. And by the way, it's interesting, isn't it, that he was called out of his land. I don't know if he was a really good pillager and then got in trouble, and God said, hey, dude, come on, or what? But that's what he was doing. And, you know, now Lot, who was moving around with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents. Very common for pillaging cultures to have shepherds. One of the reasons is because 6. This stuff is so beautiful historically. 6. But the land could not support them while they stayed together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to stay together. And quarreling arose between Abram's herdsmen and the herdsmen of Lot. The Canaanites and the Perizzites were also living in the land at the time. So, you know, and then they split up, right, into their different things. Part of the problem with the shepherds, with a domestic shepherding cultures, you have to move because you wipe out your grazing lands, right? And also the agriculture guys get irritated, but then you just pillage their stuff. So it's really a great way to do business. You know, it's funny because you can read between the lines because we know this is stuff they don't teach us that they ought to, right, in history. It's kind of funny. They always have these, what do you call it? They always have these, they want to have these aha moments or whatever. They make up stuff, right? I mean, we're not making up stuff. We're just seeing what history was doing. I think it's hilarious, you know. They're not necessarily euphemisms, they're just the way the world is. In 18 it says, in 17 it says, God said, let's see, let me go to here, 14, this is 13, 14. The Lord said to Abram after Lot had parted with him, lift up your eyes from where you are and look north and south, east and west. All the land that you see I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted. Go walk through the length and breadth of the land, for I am giving it to you. So Abram moved his tents and went to live near the great trees of Mamre at Hebron, where he built an altar to the Lord. Okay, the land was given to you, and you're a pillaged culture, and you're going to walk the length and breadth. You're also going to take all the stuff the Canaanites and Perizzites have, right? So, I mean, that's pretty cool. In 18, the Lord appeared to Abram near the great trees of Mamre, where he was sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day. Abram looked up and saw 3 men standing nearby. He saw him. He hurried from the entrance to his tent to greet them and bowed low to the ground. And 9, it says, then he brought some curds and milk and a calf that had been prepared and set these before them. While they ate, he stood near them under a tree. 9, where's your wife Sarah? They asked him. There in the tent, he said. The Lord said, okay, look, the Lord keeps appearing to this guy, right? I mean, we act like it only happened once, but it happened lots of times. So the Lord is with him, permanently living in his tent. Lord said, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son. Now, Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent, which was behind him. Oh, and I want to mention this too. Why did he build an altar everywhere he went?
To mark his property.
So, what's that?
To mark his property, something.
That's not a bad idea, but it wasn't just so he could sacrifice, it's so he could,
Speak with God.
so he could eat meat. You can't eat meat without sacrifice, right? You have to sacrifice the meat. This is something lost in our culture. Why did they build altars? Because they wanted to eat meat. He was a shepherd, and he was a pillage. It's always good to eat your pillage, before it rots. But, every time it says he built an altar, he had to build an altar so he could sacrifice the meat. This is really critical. This is critical in all ancient cultures, from the Greeks to whoever you want. Abram and Sarah in 11 were already old and well advanced years, and Sarah was past the time of childbearing. So she laughed to herself and thought, after worn out, said to her, you guys know the whole thing. Let's see. And in 33, I think this is interesting. When the Lord had finished speaking with Abraham, he left and Abraham returned. This was about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. So let's go to 10. Now, here's the NIV in 10. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. Now, this is a very, very interesting statement that we have in the Greek, in Hebrews. Here's let's parse it. For, gar, assigning a reason, he looked for it, to accept from some source. It's not a, it's the, it's ho. The polis. A polis is a town with walls. A town with walls, which hath, no, it's echo, it's to hold. This is the word thalimlios. Thalimlios, something put down. Whose, and it's not whose, it's the builder. Teknites, literally an artisan, can be a builder. And kai, maker, a worker for the people. This is really interesting. Why didn't I give you the translation of that word? It's a maker, it's a work for the people. And where's that word? It's demiurgos. Demiurgos, literally a worker, someone who works with a mechanic. So an artisan and a crafter, someone who crafts stuff. So here's the literal of this, and I think it works as a translation because I didn't retranslate it. Assigning a reason, he accepted from some source. The town with walls held something put down the artisan and worker for the people of God. So assigning a reason, he accepted from some source. The town with walls held something put down the artisan and worker for the people of God. people got. What was the town? What was the town that was put down? I don't know. I did not plot it on a map. Anybody ever plot Ai and Bethel and where this is exactly? The areas? I don't know if they, but there is a town. There is a town that's very important that has that's shaped like the letter J, and, well, at least in ancient times, and is very important in this land. Jerusalem. Jerusalem. I will posit that this is specifically talking about the town with the walls. This is not a generic, let's see, what does it say? For he is looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. Okay. If you were, who's the guy who wrote it? Pilgrim's Progress, John Bunyan. If you were reading John Bunyan, you would say he's talking about, well, either one, Jerusalem. He's talking about Jerusalem, right? Yeah, John Bunyan, Jerusalem. We as English speakers immediately go to the correct source because we are very euphemistic in our thoughts. The Greeks wouldn't have to go that far. Probably a Greek speaker, a thinker, would say, sign of reason, he accepted from some source the town with walls. There is only one, the town with walls. If you read British Victorian literature, when they say they're going down to town, where are they going? Huh?
Oh,
London. London! Yeah. Always in Victorian literature, when they're saying, I'm going down to town, they're going to London town. Period. Dot. There's no other town you go down to in British literature. Okay. Yes, sir.
I was just gonna say, because McKeesel did it, was praised to Jerusalem.
Yes.
Okay, that makes sense in that it would be settlement area.
Well, he was high priest of an area, right? And I don't,
But
does it
wasn't he
say?
from, I thought he was from Salem, which was.
From Salem.
To Salem, which was Jerusalem.
Yeah, Salem and Jerusalem. And by the way, well, he was, I didn't totally close my notes. He came to Bethel, between Bethel and Ai, where his tent had been earlier, and then he was at Marm, at Hebron.
Yeah, that's, Ai and Bethel are really close to Jericho, I mean, north of Jerusalem,
Yeah.
and then Hebron's south, and
Right.
Well, he was at Marm, at the trees of Marm, near Hebron. Look,
where he's buried, and Hebron is where he's buried.
well, see, the thing is, here we have a problem, okay? I would love for us, and this is, by the way, this is a problem in Tübingen School, right? You remember the Tübingen School bad guys? They're still the bad guys, okay? But the Tübingen School problem was they looked at the Bible and they tried to put all the places where they should be. And by the way, as archaeology has gotten better, we found more and more of these places, right? Some we have not been able to identify as well as we'd like. This is in direct contrast to, for example, the Book of Mormon. What is one of the great characteristics of the Book of Mormon?
What, that's not, has no
Nothing
historical
findable.
proof or whatever.
Nothing findable.
whatsoever.
Can't find anything.
Yeah, the thing about the Book of Mormon, which is really interesting, is he was either so bad a historian or so misguided or so fake, right? That no place mentioned in the Book of Mormon has ever been found on the North or South American continents. Not even close. Not even a smidgen close. Now, this is almost an impossibility, a miraculous impossibility. Even a blind squirrel finds a nut once in a while. This blind squirrel did not find a single nut in the whole book that he wrote, full of places and named places that were, and by the way, none of the named places that he named that were in the old world have ever been discovered. Remember, he supposedly found the two lost tribes of Israel, and they went to South America and North America, right? None of the places he mentions in the old world are real either. So that's a miracle. I mean, it's astounding how you can be so wrong, completely. We know, though, that these places exist because we have them in other historical documents. The problem we have is we don't know exactly where they are, right? It's just like, have you ever tried to find the boundary stones on your property or the boundary stakes on your property?
Yes,
Is it hard?
yes.
Yes.
They're notable.
And these boundaries, these stones, most of these boundary stakes have been put in within the last 100 years, or 50 years, or 20 years. And you have problems finding it? How could this be? So, do you think 2,500 years ago, 3,000 years ago, it's going to be hard to find places? Oh yeah. You know, rivers changed their flow. Mountains bow down. Mountains have been crushed. You know, whole areas have changed. There used to be the cedars of Lebanon. How many cedars of Lebanon are there? Yeah, there ain't none. You know, the Great Forest of Spain. You ever heard of the Great Forest of Spain? Spain was known for its forests. What happened to them?
Deforestation.
No, they cut them down for the Armada. Well, if you know that human deforestation, they cut down the Spanish, Spaniards had these beautiful pine forests. They cut them all down to build the Armada. They had to build 3. The English burned all 3, and that was the end. And so the end of the Spanish, you know, the Great Spanish Forest, and they still haven't regrown because they deforested the land and they got desert. So just saying, you know, human beings have been around for a while messing up stuff. But in any case, what is really interesting about this is this has got to point us to Jerusalem. And in the wisdom, I don't know if this is helpful at all, but you know, sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. In Wisdom 13:1, it says, "For all people who were ignorant of God were foolish by nature, and they were unable from the good things that are seen to know the one who exists, nor did they recognize the artisan while paying heed to his works." And so the reason this fits is because, isn't it interesting that the word is basically artisan and craftsman? So an artisan makes art and a craftsman makes, we would say, crafts, right? A builder. I think it's very interesting. But in wisdom it says, "For all people who are ignorant of God were foolish by nature, and they were unable from the good things that they are seen to know the one who exists, nor did they recognize the artisan while paying heed to his works." And the reason this is a really good verse is because, remember, every one of these people that are hearing this, right? Where does their mind go? Well, not just to Jerusalem, but to wisdom. Because wisdom is part of the Septuagint. It's an apocryphal work, but they know it, right? And so, when they're reading this, you see what they're getting, right? And what's the focus of this? The focus of this is, 1, but persuasion stands under expectation of proof of deeds not seen. And it says specifically in wisdom, "For all people who were ignorant of God were foolish by nature, and they were unable from the good things that are seen to know the one who exists."
Okay, now where is that from?
In wisdom, that's the apocryphal, is Wisdom 13:1. I don't think I put it in your reference documents. But it's worth seeing because, remember, they'll see it in the context, and I didn't give you the context. But anyway, thank you, Father, for your word. We pray you look after us this week. In your name we pray, amen.